Welcome to Hidden Oaks, our serene 46-acre off-the-grid ranch, dedicated to guiding you on your path to recovery from addiction and past traumas. Here, surrounded by the tranquility of nature, we offer safe space for renewal and growth. At Hidden Oaks, we understand that the journey to recovery can be challenging. That's why our compassionate team is here to support you every step of the way, providing personalized treatment programs tailored to your unique needs. Take the first step towards reclaiming your life today. Call us at 972-932-2033 or visit our website at resolutionshealthcare.com to learn more. Remember, the path to recovery runs through Hidden Oaks. Let us help you find your way.
Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle. My name is Alan Hyde, and tonight we have a special panel to discuss the topic of trauma and EMDR treatment and just in general treatment of trauma when you're coming to therapy. We have three esteemed guests who've joined me on the show before, who you may recognize, but we will introduce them as we go. We have Crystal Valdez, licensed clinical social worker supervisor, and EMDR-T. Yes. Jenny Lockwood, licensed clinical social worker, also supervisor.
Yes.
Yeah. And Amaka Agulue, which I believe I pronounced correctly this time.
Almost. Agulue.
Correct. Licensed mental health counselor.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to learn much more about you ladies tonight, but why don't we just start with how we on the panel have done before. We'll kind of start on the left and we'll go around and just explain your background and why working with trauma has become kind of a background for you and how you're navigating all that in your practice.
Yay. Okay, how did I do on the podcast last time? I'd like to say 10 out of 10. Would recommend doing it again. Let's see. I started getting into trauma treatment. I think I've always known that I wanted to be in this kind of realm. I thought it would be less clinical and I would be in like a CPS caseworker kind of role. But it just really resonates with my calling and like what I feel God has purposed me to do is to help people break cycles. And I think when you have persistent trauma and you recognize the big picture behind it, there's so many different avenues to tackle it from. And it brings me a lot of fulfillment to walk people through that.
I think I got into kind of trauma work just due to just being a social worker in general. I mean, my very first job out of undergrad was CPS, so that's inherently a lot of trauma that you're witnessing. And then working in school systems and treatment facilities, I mean, there was just so much trauma history in people's stories. So I knew that by the time I got to private practice and owning my own business, that trauma was going to be a really big focus. I think especially when I went through the EMDR training, and that it just really solidified my niche.
Yeah, I think for me, trauma has always been a big part of mental health and, you know, why we need the support in the first place. And I also started with CPS out of grad school, and it was very intense in that there was a lot of acute care needed and there was a lot of sort of immediate support. So from there, I knew that there's a lot more to mental health, trauma being the big core avenue for a lot of people seeking treatment. So that led me further down into the treatment of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's good to have all three of you back. I know all three of us at different points have spoken about trauma and your guys' unique approaches. And I think it'll just be wonderful for our guests listening tonight to hear the different perspectives, because we're going to get into, I think, first a direction of defining trauma, and we know as clinicians that could probably take all night, but we're gonna pare it down as best we can for you guys, and just having had conversations with all three of you, I know we're gonna have some wonderful information shared tonight. So whoever wants to jump in first, and then we'll kind of just jump around of defining trauma, kind of what is it, where does it come from, and we'll go from there.
I think trauma is really sort of any type of adverse, unexpected event that a person can go through where they have a really difficult time being able to like process the experience and move beyond it because of however the situation ends up impacting them in the moment. So certainly it can be like a single incident event like a car crash or a natural disaster, or it can become much more complicated than that due to like different type of abuses or just chronic neglect, say childhood, things like that.
I think of the PTSD definition, and when I like explain that to clients, a lot of times people have trauma and they don't know that it's trauma. So I kind of frame it from the perspective that if you have ever been in a situation where you felt like you were in danger for your life or like just bodily harm, that kind of qualifies. And I venture out and say if you grew up in situations or you currently walk through situations where you're chronically lacking for security, like financially, housing, safety in any aspect, like that's traumatic in and of itself too. So the one-time single events, and I also really try to educate people on the fact that when you don't have security and stability and safety for sure for a long time, that can also traumatize people.
Yeah. I like to think of trauma as sort of an open wound that is sustained. So exactly what you both are speaking to, those events, and then what sort of keeps that wound open is, is what we call trauma, that sort of festering wound there.
Yeah. It's interesting because we'll get into this a little bit later in the show, but one of the questions, just even for my own edification, as I have a chance to learn from you wonderful ladies, is we'll discuss kind of the difference between like acute trauma and complex trauma and those kind of things. But I hear that as you ladies are already touching on the differences in the way they, I like the way that you had put that, just like what's keeping this open. Yeah. Got to have these conversations. Is there anything you ladies would add to like what constitutes, from a psychological perspective, the diagnosis that we would give in a clinical setting of, let's say, PTSD or like some of the trauma-related diagnosis?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because from a PTSD specific diagnosis, there is very specific criteria that you have to meet, and there is kind of like a list of events that one might experience that would qualify as a traumatic event. And if those specific events haven't happened, or you're not exhibiting avoidance symptoms, or like a lot of reactivity, like you're kind of back in the moment, and some other qualifiers too, then you don't technically meet the criteria for PTSD, but that doesn't mean you don't have trauma.
Yeah. I think of all the timelines, like within 6 months, within 3 months, like there's all these very in a box kind of, I don't know, just criteria. That's the word that keeps popping up. But it makes me think of like, I don't know, it makes me think of insurance purposes when we have to put like other adverse reactions to stress. And I'm like, it's low-key just trauma still.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just makes me think about how, if you're not meeting the criteria and you yourself aren't in tune with there's something wrong, there might be that trauma lying in the subconscious.
Yeah.
And it comes out in, all these different ways. So, yeah, there's a definition, but then there's also like the lived experience and even how the brain makes sense of trauma, tries to get you through and can sort of mask what's underneath.
Yeah, it was, I think, in different ways with all three of you. And then I was watching a clip of a video we had posted with another guest, and we were talking about it doesn't so much matter what we call it. Let's just treat it, And that seems to be a theme on this show, especially when you get a group of clinicians together. It's like we know the information, but at the end of the day, we know what's most important is that relationship and making sure we're resolving issues.
Yeah.
Outside of the psychological realm of the book, the DSM, let's talk a little bit about maybe the difference between acute trauma, make sure I get these correct, chronic trauma and complex trauma. We don't need to go into any like in-depth research, and we'll kind of speak directly to the individuals listening, but what are some of the differences? And you ladies have already been touching on it tonight.
I'm gonna give y'all the easy one. Acute is like car crash. Like it happened, it's very instantaneous, very, like, you can point out when it started, and I don't know, maybe not when it ends, but it's very apparent when that trauma happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm gonna let y'all do the other ones.
Yeah, there's like an inciting incident.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think for like complex trauma, really kind of the definition is if trauma occurred in childhood. That's a really great place to start. That in and of itself already makes it complicated. So it can be trauma from childhood, it can be reoccurring events from experienced over time through childhood, or you can even develop complex trauma in adulthood if you have, again, repeated traumatic events. You could have a perfectly fine childhood, and then things begin to happen as an adult, and then that creates the complex trauma.
I guess they left chronic to you.
Yeah. So chronic, you can think of it's long-standing. It's something that you are dealing with in an extensive way. It feels like it's never ending. It's sort of always been there. The person feels that it's almost a part of them.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting as I was listening and just watching as you guys gave the answers, our conversation was a lot about acute trauma.
Yeah.
All right. Our conversation was a lot about complex trauma, and remembering your perspective from when we sat down months ago, your perspective was always healing those open wounds, the
Yes.
chronic issues. And so maybe as we kind of just develop this conversation, we kind of roll with that perspective that's unfolding here, and that way the listeners get those different perspectives, knowing that if they want to find you in your clinical practice, all three of you work with any range of trauma, but that way they can start to get some deeper perspectives on each.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of just go back and forth as we unfold. Healing the wound. So I want to hear again a little bit more your perspective of working with trauma. So these ladies, they work EMDR. You have experience with some of those things, but you also take some unique approaches to treating trauma. And I think it'd be wonderful for the listeners to hear some more of that again.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm not trained in EMDR, but I'm trained in another modality that is relatively similar. It's called emotional transformation therapy, ETT. So it does work with that subconscious imprint of trauma. It uncovers the underlying emotions of trauma. And what I love about it is that it's so precise in that it uses color, eye movement, right? Similar to EMDR, but it removes or peels back the layers of the trauma and gives the person the ability to process it in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a relatively safe way.
That sounds cool.
For those listening, I think it was 2 weeks ago, you'll see the video up there, Dr. Stephen Vasquez, which you introduced me to. He was on the show a couple weeks ago, and it's fascinating. So to have another chance to hear about kind of the practical implementation to that as we get into the conversation a little bit more will be great. And we'll get into like case studies and things like that a little bit in a bit, but I'll look forward to hearing much more about that. Yeah. EMDR for complex trauma.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a big question. And I think EMDR is a fantastic modality. It might not be appropriate for everyone, and it really kind of depends on the symptoms that the person is experiencing. But I will say for complex trauma, it can be a really great way to identify, I mean, not only these like experiences that you've had throughout your lifespan, but what are they all connected to in terms of like these negative core beliefs that you've developed about yourself that are often very subconscious. And so being able to kind of target that and then pull up memories that are associated with that belief and begin to do the reprocessing of that and then the reinstallation of a new positive, more adaptive belief is where, I mean, it's just really amazing work that can be very transformative for people.
Yeah. Do you, I know we kind of touched on this before because you work with a lot of different age ranges with your trauma work. Do you do a lot of work with like inner child work or shadow work? You kind of hear the pop culture terms, but do you do a lot of that in your practice as well?
I do. I mean, I don't really necessarily frame it like that. I do actually use inner child a lot. I don't necessarily say shadow very often because people don't understand that fully, but that's okay. but yes, I kind of do like parts work with people often, which really kind of helps them understand that we have like all these different pieces to ourselves, and sometimes these different parts are affected in ways that other parts maybe aren't necessarily impacted as much, but the wounded part is really the area that needs the healing.
Yeah. Acute trauma.
Okay, so acute trauma, I think the really cool thing about EMDR that doesn't get talked about enough is the fact that there's so many different protocols that you can use. So I actually in my practice use more of like the full reprocessing, getting that main negative belief, but there's also protocols, and I think they're used widely in like ERs and when events happen within like 48 hours or something along those lines. But you can desensitize and help people get back to like a functioning state if they experience something super traumatic that just has them, I wouldn't say catatonic, but just very...
Just definitely that shock level.
Shock is way better than catatonic. Different levels. So yeah, I don't do too much of that in my practice, but I have been able to use maybe just bits and pieces of the protocol and like the bilateral stimulation to help people process things that happened somewhat recently without taking them all the way through reprocessing and changing their main belief about themselves.
And I imagine, just as we have this conversation, ETT as well as EMDR uses a lot of the bilateral and eye movement and things like that. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting that. And
That's
kinda,
true.
Yeah. Can we give just kind of a snippet, and we can just kind of go this way of like, what is the bilateral and why is that so important in the reprocessing of our emotions and traumas?
Yeah. The way that I was explained the bilateral stimulation in my EMDR training and the way that I repeat it out because it was easy to digest is the fact that when we go to sleep, our eyes will go like this. And they did research and they believe that that is a sign that your brain is processing. So what you're doing with EMDR is you're stimulating your brain on both sides. And then with the questions that we ask and the way that we go through the assessment and basically turn on your processing system, we're activating your brain's processing, but instead of being asleep, you have full control. So you get to take a step back if you get too stimulated or if it gets too hard. And there's a lot of different options. So you can like tap on your legs. I love the butterfly hug. That's my go-to. Or you can make your therapist hold their hand in front of you and get a shoulder workout.
That's what I do.
Yeah.
My left shoulder, it's ripped.
You're like, okay, don't. And then there's also, I don't know if you use them, but there's buzzers that people can hold in their hands and they just vibrate back and forth. With kids, you can do stomping. Like, it really doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you are doing it in the right order at the right speed, which is why people cannot do EMDR on themselves.
Yes, correct. Don't try, please.
Yeah, don't do it.
Yeah, I think just to add to that is like bringing in the idea of like a dual awareness. And so you're doing the back and forth with eye movements or, the buzzy things that you're holding, but you're also holding in this memory. And so that's what you're processing. So your brain is focusing on this memory while it's also doing something else. And so I think that's a big part of why it's so effective.
Yeah, even as I hear that, it's like that maybe is why it's so effective for like taking the skills outside of the room and actively functioning in your life, because that's how life is going to come at you.
Yes.
I am very curious about the implementation with maybe bilateral or not, but with the light frequencies in treating trauma. And I'm curious if you could put some words to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So similarly, when you're in that REM cycle, that REM cycle, and your brain, your mind, they're sort of recalibrating, rebalancing, integrating everything that was taken in from the day. So ETT basically works from the premise that seeing the colors in our environment, seeing the light, whenever there's an experience that happens, our brain interprets it based on what visual stimulation is available. And so when we're reprogramming or sort of pulling out, tapping into the subconscious and pulling out that memory, you may notice there are things that you didn't even remember in the instant come up because it's in the subconscious and it's sort of layered. So that light, that color just gives you an opportunity to tap into a space that isn't always readily available.
Yeah, I got this question about EMDR the other day from my significant other, and I thought it was a brilliant question because I couldn't quite answer, and I said, but you know what? Tomorrow night. How important is it that we're getting into like them actually remembering these memories versus kind of just processing snippets of them? What would you ladies say to that, or in your guys' approach?
I would say, it goes back to, the book, The Body Keeps Score, right? Our body, our mind, our connection to events that are happening. So when you are tapping into a certain part of your brain and you're peeling back the layer, so to speak, there may be emotional relationships with different parts of your body. So that's sort of embedded in the layers and things like that. And similar to EMDR, I'm guessing there's some physiological affect as well that is presented.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the types of EMDR that you can do is like pulling the body in and having the client kind of identify the emotion that they're feeling in the moment when they think about the memory, where that's located in the body, and helping the body kind of also reprocess the experience, because the body experiences the trauma. So the body has to be involved in the repair of the trauma.
Yeah. I think the thing that comes to mind for me is I always tell my clients, one, there's no pressure. Like, you cannot say the wrong thing in EMDR. And two, I really enjoy EMDR because you don't necessarily have to, like, tell me all the details, and it doesn't even have to make sense. We can be processing a trauma that comes from, like, neglect in your childhood, and all of a sudden you think of a rubber duck. And I'm like, all right, just focus on that rubber duck and go with it. And the cool thing about EMDR is it's going to get all of the junk out. And we don't have to do the job of putting those dots together or making it make sense. And the client doesn't need to worry about how that one thing is connected to their experience. They just have to keep letting their body get rid of the junk so that when we get to the right space, we can fill in that empty space with something that's more, like you said, adaptive, something that they can learn from and use, and it's helpful for them in the future.
And they often come up with that in the middle of the processing session. It is so cool to witness, like, you're doing all these like sets back and forth. And then, I don't know, like, however long it takes, but at some point you can just see this like switch in their brain. They just start, the things that come up are a very different tone. They're starting to like make comments that are much more realistic and adaptable for the event. I mean, it's really amazing to witness.
And it's cool to see when they do have specific memories, because some people do have, like, I remember, this is random, I'm not telling y'all secrets, y'all. I remember somebody saying, like, they looked through, like, a door and they could see themselves, or this is a story. But they'll go from, like, I saw this bad thing happening, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can't remember that. Or, like, the picture's blurry and it becomes distorted. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what your brain is doing, but it's giving you relief. And the fact that that, like, is happening, I don't even need to make it make sense to know that it's doing something good, and it just makes me so happy for them.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that with ETT, right? Those surprise moments where things get integrated in a way that you're like, I never could have, done that for you. Your brain is doing the work itself.
Yes.
And one of the really cool things is with the colors, sometimes when a person dissociates, the color magenta shows up as a way for the brain to, it's sort of like a safety resource color. So it's like the brain's way of saying you're safe, it's okay. So I just think that's really cool how the brain does its thing,
Yeah. What's nice too is I had Dr. Vasquez on a couple weeks ago, and I certainly wasn't a skeptic because I had read some of the research. And with the light treatments, I was like, this is so fascinating. I remembered the conversation that we had about it, but we hadn't gone too in depth with it. But just the research is showing these aspects that you're touching on, that he was touching on a couple weeks ago. And I think just for those listening, both of these modalities, if you are dealing with trauma, finding a professional who is trained in these things is going to be really helpful. One, for I think a big thing in our society today is name it by its proper name, right, and then get to work.
Yes.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about that a few weeks ago on the show too, of like the social media aspect and how things get misrepresented, mislabeled, and this topic especially in the pop culture gets misrepresented, and this is probably one of the most important.
Yeah. And I think the like specialization, because these aren't things that you can just do straight out of school. Like you have to get the training and do the consultations, and then I don't know for your training, but for EMDR, like we had to get EMDR practiced on us before we could go and do that to other people. So it's this different level, and I think like people, I wish it was appreciated more because it's so cool. Like you said, we can't do this on our own. Talk therapy will take you very far, but sometimes people really need that extra step. And as therapists, like to know I can't do it by myself, but I have this really cool tool in my back pocket that I can pull out when I'm lacking. Like, thank you, Jesus.
Yeah.
I think it's a good call out too, because I was reflecting on this the other day when someone was asking me about my approach, and you know, I'm very straight up in the sense of like I was trained in a psychoanalytic approach. So when it comes to things like OCD, where if we're going to sit down and just process, I'll make it worse, you know, and I know myself. I'll process with you until the cows come home. So I refer out for these things. And trauma, and for me, when it comes into my practice, I'm dealing with trauma as it relates to substance use primarily in the family. So I take a very relational approach. But when it gets into some of these acute situations where they need some relief or they need some long-term tools, I'm always referring out. And then they'll come back to me for maybe like the healthy male figure, you know, and that's how I've supplemented with a lot of clinicians over the years.
Yeah, that's a great approach.
Yeah, you know, and I hear the pieces here of like, you know, if you are listening and you just need that support for some of these more difficult emotional experiences, these approaches that the ladies are touching on tonight are effective. And you can take their word for it, right? Because they've been vetted before they were on the show, and we've had them on before, and so you know that the value is here. But also, I mean, these things have been around for some time now, and we're starting to see both with ETT and with EMDR that people are getting better.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it's really cool, like just hearing you say that people will come back to you because, you know, sometimes they need that like healthy male role model or connection in their life. And it just makes me very thankful that there's so many therapists out there that we can cater to different populations, and knowing that there's such a variety or diversity within like the therapy world now. I have so many clients that come to me and they're like, I just like talking to you because I know like you come from a similar background or like nationality, like all the things. And I think there's also just a beauty in that I like to point out. Like, guys, go to therapy. There's a male therapist right here, and there's a lot more.
Yeah, we need to talk through things. I'll tell you what, when I sit down with men, I'm like, oh, bud, no one has listened to you in a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But it's nice, you know, that seems to be shifting. But I think just in general, the whole conversation is shifting, and I'm glad to be doing this because it seems like people are interacting with it and latching on to some of the things that you guys are sharing week to week.
And, you know, I just want to point out with EMDR, it's not just a trauma treatment modality.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
I use it often with anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
I kind of like reverse engineer it, and I'm like, okay, well, what are these negative beliefs that you have about yourself? And then we start connecting the experiences that are linked up to that, and then that's what we can start to target.
I saw a lot of head nods on that. This is good for me to hear too, because, you know, oftentimes I'll think like, you know, I need to refer out for certain things, or like, you know, when it's someone who's severely depressed, I'm thinking, okay, I need to get them an evaluation for maybe some medications and those kind of things. But to know, and like I've heard this before, but just to see the head nods on this is like there are different modalities that are designed initially for trauma that obviously have shifted to treat other things.
It's really cool to use it to like get symptoms to subside or just to be alleviated. It helps with like people that have insomnia, sleep issues, panic disorder. Sometimes just being able to help people's like bodies not be so triggered or like overly sensitized by things. It just does so much, and it works fast. Like, you get so much out of one session with EMDR. Does it work fast for you too?
Yeah. Not to compare the two, because as
do
as
it.
much as I hear about EMDR, I'm like, I love it. And ETT, again, very similar, and it does work very quickly. One of my favorite things to use it for is sort of reprogramming negative beliefs, sort of that negative thought pattern. Sometimes it can be difficult to not only come out of that, but to introduce more positive language. And sometimes I would use a light device for that to sort of support that connection to the mind saying, oh, I do believe this, because it can take time. So I love it so much.
Yeah. It's so cool.
Yeah, those practical changes and shifts that I think just in therapy, the hope is that you start to see those things unfolding quick. I'll use the word quickly just for a lack of vernacular here to describe. We want to see it, unfolding while meeting them where they're at. I think is important to add that last part in, because it's like, we know we're not going to push the client to be anywhere, but for those listening, if you come into our offices, we're not going to poke and prod you, but we want to see your growth. We want to be involved in that with you. And just listening to you ladies and the work that you're doing in the community, it's fun for me every week to bring everyone in and hear the things that are working.
And I'm really glad that you said that, because EMDR, what we're talking about is like a specific stage of it, the bilateral stimulation, but there's 8 stages to it.
Yes.
And there's a lot of preparatory work that goes in. We want to make sure that the clients are really well resourced, meaning you've got good ability to kind of regulate yourself if you start to feel overwhelmed, because EMDR, it brings up stuff. And we want to make sure that clients know and trust that, like, hey, I've got these tools that my therapist has taught me. I've been practicing them. So if I need them in the session, then I've got them. And my therapist is right there with me.
There's also like resourcing with the bilateral stimulation. So before we ever take you into the space where we're like, all right, we're going to think about this really hard thing, we're going to help people like with the tapping, like start to associate places or songs or words. And you really get to like build in safety. And it's super cool. I could program like a cloud into somebody, and that could be their safe place. And they can be in the middle of, I don't know, rush hour traffic and just think the word cloud. And it's like,
Yeah, there's a lot of resourcing in ETT. It sounds like there's a lot of creativity, right? A lot of allowance for creativity in both of these modalities. But one of the ways that we resource is through color, right? What is a color that feels good? It really invites the person to be in tune with their body, what is happening immediately. And a lot of times it's a very quick response for people to notice what feels good, what doesn't.
I love that.
What's my resource, what's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a certain sense of empowerment in the foundation building too. You know what it makes me think of is like when I have someone come to me for recovery, and maybe they're not privy yet to the 12 steps. It's like, we're not going to do a whole lot of processing on the complex nature of your family until you're in those rooms and you're not using substances anymore. And I've always kind of, as I've heard EMDR and different trauma treatments, there's an aspect always in this work of, we need to get you here and seated and heard and understood, and then we can make some motion. My approach is very like, we need to get you in those rooms, or don't waste my time. I'm gentle about it, but that tends to be my approach.
It's like, disclaimer, it's not that bad.
Yeah. It would be the same, I think, like with EMDR, where it's like, if we're not going to get grounded, we can't move through the stages of EMDR. Right.
Sometimes that's hard for people. I don't know if you've had that experience, but there's a lot of things that people don't know that they don't know until they sit in front of a therapist. And I'll say, it's not just because I'm a therapist. I went through that too with my therapist, and you can't rush it. Like, your body literally won't let you go further in the process if you get stuck or you haven't done enough prep work. And that doesn't mean you failed. That's just more information that we get to use later to figure out how do we get you a little bit further along in your processing. But I think EMDR is super cool because there's so many like natural stop points and so much to work with, and it's your body just gives us information. You're just like a giant puzzle.
Yeah. And I use a lot of somatic work in my practice. I really want clients to start to be able to connect and feel into their body if that feels safe to them. It doesn't always feel safe.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, the body gives us so much information. And I think a lot of times when we're kind of disconnected from that, people don't even realize that even as they're talking about a distressing event, that even just talking about it can send you into like sympathetic, and your heart's racing and you start to talk really fast and your eyes are darting and you're really shifty in your seat, and they're not like connecting that with like, oh, I'm having a reaction just to talking about this. It's like, okay, we gotta like slow it down. Like trauma is all about going really slow. Trauma healing is about going really slow.
Yeah. And to slow some of this down as well, just to make sure we're capturing everything that was just shared there too, is somatic, and I may butcher this, but I'm going to try my best. Somatic is your felt emotional sense, right, in your body of whether it's trauma, but also your emotional experiences.
Yeah, just what even you're feeling right now in this moment.
Yeah.
Soma's just Greek for body.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And then sympathetic, we're obviously talking about the nervous system, but to kind of slow some of those things down, because a lot of the work, and all three of you ladies during your individual episodes had talked about the nervous system. I was watching
Obsessed.
our video. Yeah.
so obsessed.
I was cracking up because you like lit up when you were talking about the nervous system last time. And maybe we can kind of, because I have a few more questions here, but maybe we can kind of go this way around and just kind of talk a little bit about getting the body seated in the room and healing that nervous system. And it could be from the perspective of how you work with it, or just any tidbits you'd like to share on that.
Yeah, sure. I too think it's so important that we focus on what's happening in the body. And over the past, I think, few decades, it's, I think, been more integrated into therapeutic work at all, because we realize how big of a part our body's physiological reaction to this wounding, what big of a part it plays, right? So in my work, I'm always checking to see what the person is already doing, because a lot of people already sort of have their ways for managing their nervous system. Breathing is a huge place to start for a lot of people. Just simply, am I even noticing how my breath stops in my chest versus goes all the way in my belly? Am I noticing how my arms tense up when I hear certain things, or if I'm talking to a specific person on the phone? There are all these tells. So it's worth investigating with the person first, and then offering them from our plethora of tools what can be most supportive, or what could be added on to something they're already doing.
Yeah, same. I mean, I always love to know what clients' own kind of skills and resources are to begin with. And then I like to just offer some extra ones that we practice in the session. I mean, some of it is just as simple as, we're just doing like a body scan, and they're just kind of sitting there in a comfortable position, and we're just going from place to place in the body, and they're just simply noticing, not with any judgment. We're just noticing what's happening. Lots of grounding and like how to kind of just reorient into the space. And a lot of clients walk away from these experiences feeling like, oh, wow, I really do notice a shift, and I feel a lot calmer. I really love to end my sessions with these types of practices, so that when they're leaving the office or they're logging off the computer, that they feel much more grounded and can kind of go back into life.
Yeah. Y'all, I nerd out when it comes to the nervous system. And I think that one of my favorite pieces of it is even just by educating somebody that you have a nervous system, and there's 3 different states it can be in, and there's different like mixtures of states that you can be in. That is healing in and of itself, because sometimes people are like, I just get really jittery and I just can't focus and I start sweating, and they think something's wrong with them. And I'm like, no, your body's a system, and it's analyzing stuff and assessing things outside of you, and it's actually doing its job. You just are either disconnected from it, or maybe you don't know how to get yourself back into the feel-good zone, and so you get stuck. Like, there's so many things that go into your nervous system, but once you really like learn it, and I love it. I don't know if you got a cheat sheet during your EMDR training, but we got a cheat sheet that shows you the 3 zones. I will literally have my clients like fill that out with what their nervous
Yes.
system is, and it's like a map for your system. So even if they never come back, they have a really good tool,
I do
and
that
they know
all
themselves.
the time. I didn't get it through EMDR training, but
Mhm.
yes, we map their nervous system.
It
I
is
call it
my
befriending the
favorite.
nervous system.
Yes, I'm like, listen, if we just give you a cheat sheet for yourself, at least you know what's going on. And if you know you don't like to be in this red zone where everything's like moving too fast, then you pick a coping skill that slows you down. It's a cheat sheet for life. It makes me so happy.
Yeah, yeah, those kind of practical skills are always so effective. You know, and I like the air of what we've kind of all been talking about tonight is like, we're not going to take you guys through these things without having done these things ourselves. And
Yeah.
I know just getting to know all 3 of you and having sat down with you before, we're doing the work, and it's nice to just kind of see that unfold as we're imparting this to other individuals listening. And, you know, one of the things with somatic work that I always tell people, I never knew hot tears were a thing until I felt them myself. There's been a lot of little things, like both as a clinician but in my own work, that has softened this hard dude's heart over the years. And some of that nervous system, experiential kind of trauma work has really opened my eyes to a lot of what the day-to-day person is experiencing when they open up vulnerably to come into our offices.
Yeah.
And I needed personally to go through that to see like, oh, this is not easy to ask for help.
Yeah. Just in speaking about the nervous system, as you were speaking, something came to mind in terms of the communication that we get, right? It's all messages from the body. It's all sort of an information, if you will, sort of what is happening, right? How do we tap in and dissect that information? What is it saying? What do we need to do with it? And of course, we help our clients through that, but not just the nervous system, the body in general, right? So aches and pains, even certain diseases, it sort of gives us some a map, if you will, a roadmap towards where the healing might need to take place. Yeah.
I'm curious, it's ETT?
ETT.
Okay,
Yep.
in ETT, do you guys have something like interweaves? Because sometimes in treatment, when they're processing, if they get stuck somewhere, one of my favorite things to do, and it just popped up, is if they're like, oh, I just feel like this tightness in my stomach and it won't go away, and that if they get stuck there's this really cool thing that we can do is like ask questions to get them unstuck. So you can ask them something like, well, if your stomach could talk to you and tell you what it needs, like what would it say? And sometimes that brings like really dramatic breakthroughs, and they're like, oh, I just need a hug from A, B, or C, or I just wish somebody would tell me this. And I'm like, that was in your stomach? Do you have interweaves?
Yeah, so it's sort of a part of the process in peeling back the layers, right? There are maybe if you're doing your processing and there's a stomach ache, we will follow that symptom and ask questions related to it that starts to uncover the underlying emotion, right, that's there. And a lot of times that pain, that soreness tends to relieve itself once the emotion becomes comes to the conscious space from the subconscious or gets integrated in some way. So it's really fascinating.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's nice.
All this kind of work is cool too, because I spend the bulk of my day working with dudes, as I've shared with you ladies as well, and so they'll hear about this kind of stuff, and in the process I'll kind of talk about our somatic experiences, our inner child work, and they're like, whatever, but until you've really felt that, and I'll watch dudes, they'll start to experience these things. And again, I take a very relational approach, and we're connecting kind of family dynamics is the bulk of my work, but to watch them, man, my shoulders were just so sore. But after kind of realizing what my needs were and meeting those needs and talking through that, I feel like I'm like, lighter. And EMDR and ETT have very practical ways, right? Just from chatting with the professionals to relieve that in the session. which is, it's nice. It's nice. I see it kind of in a progression over sessions just because of my approach. But it's nice to hear about. And these, you know, I was going to get into asking about kind of case studies and success of the modalities, but we've kind of interwoven that into the conversation. You said interweaves, right? Is that what you were calling? Yeah. Yeah. So it's just nice to hear from you ladies and to share that with our audience here. Any kind of last thoughts on these aspects we've been talking about, whether for EMDR or ETT, as we shift into kind of the last portion of the show?
There was something that popped into my head when you said like you take a very relational approach, and I think that's one thing that I wish everybody knew about EMDR is like when you come to therapy for EMDR, your therapist is in a sense like lending you their nervous system. So while we're tapped into your nervous system, we are, and that like really humbled me when I heard that in training. They're like, we're basically lending our nervous system to the clients, and we have to make sure that like we're in a good space to help you walk through that. But there's so much healing, I think, when you let yourself be in a space like that and get that vulnerable. It's if it's something you're thinking about, just jump in. Just test the waters, because you're not going to meet somebody who's going to push you too fast, take you too far into the process, and literally your nervous system is built to protect you, so it's not going to let you do that anyways.
Yeah, and if you're in the Dallas area, just reach out to one of these three.
Yes.
And it works just as well virtually as it does in person.
Yes.
ETT as well. Yes.
Gabe, how are we doing on time here? Oh, I've got a sixth sense with you, man. I swear it. Okay, so why don't we then transition into any call to action? You guys were already kind of touching on that of like just jump into it, but why don't we give all three of you an opportunity directly to the listeners, just what your call to action would be to work on their trauma and to come to therapy?
Well, I always sort of offer the advice, if you will, of monitoring what thoughts are coming up for you. The internal landscape is really important, and a lot of times we can't really tell person to person what someone is experiencing internally, but you know, you are your first observer. So if you notice that your thoughts are always tending towards maybe a negative, pessimistic outlook, or you're critical of yourself, that may be an indicator that you need to speak outside of the silo of your mind. And, you know, therapists are really great at holding space for that. So if it is simply, I don't, you know, feel good about these thoughts, but I don't know where to start, definitely reach out for support.
And I would just say, you know, to add on to that, you know, maybe you know that you've been through something that's been distressful in the past, and you're ready, or maybe you're not quite sure if you're ready yet, but I think really trying to find the best fit for you with your therapist, interviewing different therapists, like reaching out and having consultations, because that really is the most important part of the therapeutic work, is the relationship that you have with the person who's holding that space for you and walking alongside your healing journey.
Yes. I think if you even have the question, should I be in therapy? Like, is it worth it? It's something to explore. And if you're looking for something that's more holistic, that's like wraparound, where you get to focus on your mental health, but maybe you also have things that are going on in your life that keep you stressed out or keep you feeling like you're not doing well enough, like, go ahead and reach out. And I'm gonna shamelessly plug Dose of Changes. Like, we have different therapists on board, but I think even like you just said, find somebody who you know you can sit down and talk to. And a lot of that is just feeling who feels safe, who feels comfortable. If you're somebody who's been trying to do the work, if you're somebody who comes from like underrepresented backgrounds, you feel like you're not really seen, or you're not gonna find somebody who can just vibe with you. I'm a very informal, chill vibe, but I'm gonna make you do the hard work at your pace.
I like it.
Yeah.
You won't regret going to therapy.
No.
Maybe at first, but then you'll settle in.
You'll have a couple sessions where you're like, I don't want to see you again, but the in between before you go back again, like healing, it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A few thanks here, Gabe. Thank you so much for all the work you do and making this look beautiful. The interns in the back who are always on the social medias and making everything look great on that end. And a special thanks to Crystal Valdez, LCSW supervisor, Jenny Lockwood, LCSW supervisor, and Amaka Agulue,
Yes, you got
licensed mental health counselor. Ladies and gentlemen, we will see this panel return in a couple weeks on November 13th at our live in-person networking event and recording of Breaking the Cycle. We're off next week because we have the award ceremony for the radio network, and fingers crossed. I heard we got a lot of votes. We'll see if our show is going to win an award. And in 2 weeks, we have a school counselor. Her name is Rachel Hyde, and you heard that correct. It's my little sister, and she'll be on in 2 weeks. So we'll be back here Friday night, but we break the cycle here every week, and we break it together. 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I messed that up, but we love you. We'll see you next time.